It was 1955 in Dawson, Georgia, and the summer heat was pressing down on the cotton fields like a hand trying to suffocate the earth. A 13-year-old boy stood in the middle of a church, singing so loud that the walls seemed to shake. His name was Otis Redding, Jr., and he sang like his chest was on fire. The women in the congregation fanned themselves and whispered to each other. The preacher closed his eyes and nodded. Everyone in Vineville Baptist Church knew this boy had something. A voice that came from somewhere deeper than a child's body should allow. A sound that made you forget where you were and remember who you were at the same time. But outside that church, the world did not care about a poor black boy from rural Georgia. Outside those doors, his family was barely surviving. His father, Otis Sr., worked wherever he could find work, and his mother struggled to feed 6 children on almost nothing. The Reddings had moved from Dawson to Macon when Otis was just 2 years old, looking for a better life. What they found instead was a different shade of the same poverty. And then something happened that would change everything. Something that would force a boy to become a man long before he was ready. His father fell sick. Not the kind of sick that goes away with rest and soup, but the kind that sits in the lungs and refuses to leave. Tuberculosis, the disease that the poor could not afford to treat and the rich did not bother worrying about. Otis Sr. could no longer work. The family was collapsing under the weight of bills, hunger, and a father who was slowly disappearing. Have you ever had to choose between your dreams and your family? Between what you love and what you need to survive? At 15 years old, Otis Redding made that choice. He dropped out of Ballard Hudson High School and went to work. Not because he wanted to, not because school meant nothing to him, but because his brothers and sisters needed food. His mother needed help. His father needed medicine that they could not afford. So the boy who sang like fire in the church put his voice aside and picked up whatever job he could find. He washed cars. He worked wells. He did anything that would put a few dollars in his mother's hands. But every single night, when the work was done and the house was quiet, Otis would sit on the porch with a cheap red guitar he had somehow gotten his hands on, and he would sing. Softly, so as not to wake the family, but with everything he had. Those nights on the porch were not practice sessions. They were prayers. Prayers that someday, somehow, the voice inside him would become more than just a sound swallowed by the Georgia night. There was one place in Macon where dreams could survive. The Douglas Theater on Broadway held weekly talent shows every Saturday morning, hosted by a local disc jockey everyone called King B, Hamp Swain. The prize was $5. $5 does not sound like much now, but for a teenager trying to keep his family alive, it was a small fortune. Otis entered the competition and won. He entered again and won again. He kept entering and kept winning, 15 times in a row, until the organizers told him he could not compete anymore. They had to give someone else a chance. 15 consecutive victories at the Douglas Theater. Think about that. In a town full of aspiring musicians, a teenager with no formal training, no connections, and no money was so undeniably talented that they had to ban him from competing. But winning a talent show is not the same as having a career. Winning $5 every Saturday cannot feed a family forever. Otis needed more. He needed someone to believe in him the way those churchwomen believed in him, but with the power to actually do something about it. That someone arrived in the form of a white college student named Phil Walden. Phil was a kid himself, barely out of his teens, studying economics at Mercer University. But Phil had an obsession. He loved black music with a passion that confused everyone around him. In the segregated South of the early 1960s, a white boy managing black musicians was not just unusual, it was dangerous. But Phil did not care about the rules. He had heard Little Richard's voice coming out of the radio, and something inside him had broken open. He wanted to be part of this world, this sound, this raw and unfiltered expression of human emotion that white America was desperately trying to ignore. Phil and Otis met in Macon, and despite every social force telling them they should not be friends, they became inseparable. Sir Phil saw in Otis what the churchwomen had seen, what the Douglas Theater audiences had seen, a voice that could move mountains. Phil became Otis's manager, and the two of them began building something together. Phil booking shows, Otis singing his heart out. Two young men, one black and one white, driving through the segregated South in the same car, eating at whatever roadside stand would serve them both, sleeping in whatever motel would not turn them away. This was not a business relationship. This was a brotherhood forged in the fire of a country that wanted to keep them apart. But here is the part of the story most people do not know. Here is where the dream starts to collide with the machine. Because the music industry in the 1960s was not built to lift up black artists. It was built to extract from them. In 1958, Otis joined a local band called the Pine Toppers, led by guitarist Johnny Jenkins. Otis was not the star. He was the driver. He drove the van, loaded the equipment, and if there was time at the end of the night, they let him sing. The future King of Soul was a chauffeur. And in August of 1962, something changed. Jenkins had a recording session at Stax Records in Memphis, a small label operating out of a converted movie theater on McLemore Avenue. The studio was legendary for its raw sound, created by its house band, Booker T and the MGS, one of the first racially integrated bands in the South. Otis drove Jenkins to Memphis. His job was simple: drive, unload, wait. But Jenkins's session went badly. Time was running out, and Jim Stewart, Stax's co-owner, was about to call it a day. Then Otis asked if he could use the remaining time to record a song. There are moments in history that hinge on the smallest decisions. Stewart could have said no. He could have sent this unknown kid back to the van. But something made him say yes. Otis stepped up to the microphone and started singing "These Arms of Mine." The room went still. Steve Cropper, the legendary guitarist, stopped what he was doing. The engineers leaned forward. A voice was filling the room that did not sound like anything on the radio. Raw and wounded and beautiful. When Otis finished, Jim Stewart knew. This was not a chauffeur. This was a star. These Arms of Mine was released in October 1962 and became a modest hit, reaching the rhythm and blues charts and even crossing onto the pop charts. It was not a blockbuster. It was not a number one. But it was a door opening. Otis was signed to Volt Records, a subsidiary of Stax. His career had officially begun. But here is where the invisible trap was set. Stax Records had made a deal with Atlantic Records, based in New York City, co-founded by Ahmet Ertegun, and run by the brilliant but ruthless Jerry Wexler. Atlantic distributed Stax's records nationally. Without them, Stax's music would never leave Memphis, but the terms of the deal contained a clause that would eventually destroy everything. Atlantic was given ownership of all master recordings it distributed. Jim Stewart either did not understand or did not think it mattered. He was a former banker who just wanted to make music, not a lawyer. But Atlantic was business, and the clause meant every song recorded at Stax belonged to Atlantic. Every Otis Redding song, every Booker T track, every Sam and Dave record. The studio that nurtured the artists and paid for the sessions owned nothing. Atlantic kept the masters, and the masters are everything. Now, to his enormous credit, Otis was not naive about the business side of music. Unlike many black artists of his era who were systematically cheated out of their earnings, Otis was paying attention. In 1965, he and Phil Walden co-founded their own publishing company called Red Wall Music. He created his own label, Otis Records. He invested in real estate in Georgia. He bought a 300-acre ranch outside of Macon that he called the Big O Ranch, complete with a 3-story house, livestock, and a lake stocked with fish. He bought 2 private planes. He made sure that he, Otis Redding, the son of a tuberculosis patient from Dawson, Georgia, was getting paid. But the system was bigger than any one man. Because even though Otis was smart about his money, the structure above him was designed to siphon wealth upward. Atlantic Records was profiting from the distribution of every Otis Redding record, while paying Stax a fraction of the revenue. And Stax, squeezed from above, could only pass along to its artists whatever was left after Atlantic had taken its share. The standard royalty rate for artists in that era was around 5% of the retail price, and that was only after the label had recouped its advances and recording costs. 5%. Imagine writing a song that changes the world, singing it with every ounce of your being, recording it in a studio where the walls are soaked in your sweat, and then receiving 5 cents for every dollar it earns. This was not unique to Otis. This was the architecture of the entire music industry. A system built by white executives to profit from black creativity. Little Richard had been cheated. Chuck Berry had been cheated. Fats Domino had been cheated. The history of American popular music is a history of genius being harvested and sold by people who could not carry a tune. But Otis kept going. He kept recording. He kept touring. Between 1962 and 1967, he released an astonishing amount of music. Pain in My Heart, Mr. Pitiful. That is how strong my love is. I have been loving you too long. Respect. Try a little tenderness. He was on the road constantly, performing over 300 shows a year, crisscrossing the country on what was known as the Chitlin Circuit, a network of venues across the American South that were safe for black performers during the era of segregation. He played juke joints and dance halls and theaters where the audiences were almost entirely black, where people who worked all week for nothing came on Saturday night to forget their troubles for a few hours. And Otis gave them everything he had. Every show, every night, no exceptions. But there was a ceiling. A glass ceiling built by race and industry politics that kept Otis Redding from reaching the mainstream white audience that was buying millions of records and making white artists rich beyond imagination. His records were hits on the rhythm and blues charts, but they rarely crossed over to the pop charts where the real money lived. His biggest songs were beloved in the black community, but virtually unknown to white America. The system was designed this way. Radio stations were segregated. Record stores were segregated. The charts themselves were segregated into pop and rhythm and blues, a divide that was not just about genre, but about race. And then something happened that nobody expected. An invitation that would change the trajectory of Otis Redding's career, and, ultimately, the trajectory of American music. The Monterey International Pop Festival, June 1967, Northern California, the birth of the Summer of Love. The festival was organized by John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas and record producer Lou Adler. It was conceived as a celebration of the new rock music, a gathering of the counterculture, a 3-day event featuring the biggest names in psychedelic rock, folk, and pop: Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, The Who, Jefferson Airplane, Simon and Garfunkel, The Byrds. The lineup was overwhelmingly white. This was the hippie generation's party, and soul music was not on the guest list. But Jerry Wexler, the same Atlantic Records executive who held the keys to Stax's master recordings, saw an opportunity. Wexler pushed hard to get Otis on the bill, not out of kindness, not out of artistic appreciation, but because Wexler understood that if Otis Redding could win over this white audience, the crossover potential was enormous. More record sales, more revenue, more money flowing through Atlantic's distribution pipeline. So Otis Redding, the son of a cotton field worker from Georgia, found himself backstage at the Monterey County Fairgrounds on the evening of June 17, 1967, about to perform for an audience unlike any he had ever faced. Tens of thousands of white hippies, people who had never heard of Otis Redding. He was nervous. This was not the Apollo. This was not the Chitlin Circuit. He was the only soul act on the bill, the only black headliner, walking into unfamiliar territory with nothing but his voice and his band. And then it was time. Booker T and the MGS took the stage first, wearing brilliant lime green suits, warming up the crowd with a set of instrumental rhythm and blues. Then Otis walked out. 6 feet 1 inch tall, 220 pounds, wearing a suit that matched his band. And he opened his mouth. The first song was Shake, a tribute to Sam Cooke. He hit the first note and something shifted in the air. The crowd, which had been casual and relaxed, suddenly snapped to attention. This was not psychedelic rock. This was not folk music. This was something raw and urgent and alive in a way that demanded your full attention. Otis was not performing for the crowd. He was attacking the stage. He was moving. He was sweating. He was screaming and whispering and pleading and commanding all at once. He performed Respect, the song he had written and recorded in 1965, the same song that Aretha Franklin had recently turned into a #1 pop hit. "This is a song a girl took away from me," Otis told the crowd, and they laughed. And then he tore into it with a ferocity that made Franklin's version sound like a lullaby by comparison. He played I Have Been Loving You Too Long, and the crowd went silent. Not bored silence, sacred silence. The silence of people who are hearing something so honest and so vulnerable that responding with anything other than reverence feels wrong. He played Satisfaction, the Rolling Stones hit, reimagined as a funky, swaggering soul anthem that made Mick Jagger's version sound like a rough draft. And then he closed with Try a Little Tenderness, and the crowd lost its mind. 20,000 people on their feet, screaming, crying, reaching toward the stage as if trying to touch the sound itself. The entire set lasted less than 20 minutes. Less than 20 minutes. And Otis Redding had conquered a world that did not even know he existed an hour earlier. Music critics would later say that no one at Monterey, not Hendrix, not Joplin, not The Who, delivered a performance that came close to what Otis did that night. He did not just win the crowd, He transformed them. He showed an entire generation of white music fans that soul music was not some separate, inferior genre to be consumed through inferior cover versions by white artists. It was the real thing. The source. The fire from which all their favorite rock and roll had been borrowed. But here is the cruel irony. The cruel, grinding irony that defined Otis Redding's relationship with the music industry. That performance, that legendary set at Monterey, was filmed by D.A. Pennebaker for a documentary that would become one of the most important concert films ever made. The footage of Otis at Monterey is now considered priceless. It has been watched millions of times. It is preserved in the Library of Congress, and Otis Redding and his estate received almost nothing from it. And because the masters of the recording, the film rights, the distribution deals, all of it was controlled by other people. People who had the contracts, people who had the lawyers, people who understood the fine print that Otis, for all his business sense, could not fully escape. After Monterey, everything accelerated. Otis was no longer just a rhythm and blues star. He was on the verge of becoming a global phenomenon. Bookings poured in. Television appearances were scheduled, or The Ed Sullivan Show, The Smothers Brothers Show. Appearances at Philharmonic Hall in New York and Constitution Hall in Washington. 1968 was going to be the year that Otis Redding became the biggest name in music. Period. But first, there was a song he needed to finish. A song unlike anything he had ever written. In August of 1967, Otis spent a week on a houseboat in Sausalito, California, just across the bay from San Francisco. He had been performing at Basin Street West, and during the downtime between shows, he sat on the deck of the boat and listened to an album that was changing the world. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles. He played it over and over. Not because he wanted to sound like the Beatles, but because the album showed him something about what music could be. It could be experimental. It could be introspective. It could be quiet and still and say more in a whisper than 1,000 screams. Sitting on that houseboat, watching the fog roll across San Francisco Bay, Otis began writing a song. A song about stillness. About watching the tide roll away. About sitting on a dock and doing nothing and feeling everything. The song was the complete opposite of everything he was known for. No screaming, no sweating, no commanding the stage like a preacher at the pulpit. Just a man, a melody, and a feeling of resignation so beautiful it could break your heart. He recorded it at Stax in November and December of 1967, working with Steve Cropper to get the arrangement exactly right. The final touch was a moment that happened almost by accident. At the end of the song, Otis was supposed to sing another verse, but he did not have the lyrics finished. So, instead, he whistled. Just a simple, aimless whistle over the fade-out. Cropper wanted to go back and add proper vocals. Otis said no. The whistle stays. It was the sound of a man at peace, a man who had stopped fighting and simply was. On December 7th, 1967, 3 days after recording the final version of that song, Otis boarded his twin-engine Beechcraft plane with his valet Matthew Kelly, pilot Richard Fraser, and 4 members of his backing band, the Bar-Kays. They were flying to Madison, Wisconsin for a concert at a local venue. The weather was terrible. Low clouds, near freezing temperatures, the kind of conditions that make small planes dangerous. At 3:28 in the afternoon, the plane began its approach to the runway at Truax Field. Something went wrong. The plane came in too low, too fast. It clipped the surface of Lake Monona and plunged beneath the icy water. Otis Redding was 26 years old. Only one person survived, trumpeter Ben Cawley, who somehow pulled himself free of the wreckage and floated in the freezing water until rescuers arrived. Everyone else was gone. Otis, Jimmy King, Carl Cunningham, Phelan Jones, Ronnie Caldwell, Matthew Kelly, Richard Fraser. 7 lives swallowed by a Wisconsin lake on a December afternoon. The song he had recorded 3 days earlier was released in January 1968. It was called "Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay," and it became the first posthumous #1 single in the history of the American music charts. It sold 4 million copies worldwide. It received more than 8 million radio plays. It became one of the most recognized songs in the history of recorded music, and Otis never heard it. He never heard the final mix. He never knew that his quiet, whistling farewell would become his most famous work. He never knew that the song he wrote on a houseboat while listening to the Beatles would outlive not just him, but the entire era that produced him. And then came the final betrayal. After Otis died, Atlantic Records moved quickly. Under its distribution deal with Stax, Atlantic owned every master recording Otis had made. Every song, every take, every whispered note. Stax, and devastated by the loss of its biggest star, realized it had lost not just Otis, but his entire catalog. Atlantic had enough unreleased material to release 3 more studio albums: The Immortal Otis Redding, Love Man, Tell the Truth, all on Atlantic's subsidiary, Atco Records, all generating revenue for Atlantic. Stax received nothing. The system worked exactly as designed. The genius was harvested. The profits flowed upward. The people who created the music were left with nothing. For Stax, the loss was devastating. The label struggled through new ownership deals with Gulf and Western, and later the Columbia Broadcasting System, each bringing new promises and new betrayals. By 1975, Stax was bankrupt. The converted movie theater on McLemore Avenue was eventually torn down, demolished, as if erasing the building could erase the memory of what happened inside it. But the memory could not be erased, because the music was too powerful, the voice was too true, and the story of Otis Redding was too important to let the industry bury along with the profits it had stolen. In 1989, Otis Redding was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. In 1999, he received the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. Rolling Stone magazine ranked him number 21 on its list of the greatest artists of all time. His songs have been covered by hundreds of artists, sampled in thousands of recordings, and streamed billions of times. The boy from Dawson, Georgia, who dropped out of school to feed his family, became one of the most important musicians in the history of the world. But the question remains: what would have happened if the system had been fair? What would Otis have created if he had lived? If he had owned his masters? He was 26. He was just beginning to evolve. Dock of the Bay was the first glimpse of a new direction. Steve Cropper said Otis was becoming more aware of the importance of lyrics. Al Bell had been encouraging him to make a singer-songwriter album. The artistic evolution that was about to happen was cut short not just by a plane crash, but by a system that had already claimed ownership of everything he would ever create. James Alexander, the Bar-Kays member who survived because he had taken a separate commercial flight that day, said it best years later. One of the many things we learned from Otis Redding was that you definitely need to own your own music. That lesson, paid for with blood and genius, and a freezing lake in Wisconsin, is the lesson that echoes through the entire history of the music industry. Today, in Macon, Georgia, there is a bridge named after Otis Redding and a statue of him sitting on the dock of the bay. In Memphis, on the site where Stax once stood, there is now the Stax Museum of American Soul Music. Inside are the instruments Booker T and the MGS played, the microphones that captured Otis's voice, the stories of what happened before the contracts and the lawyers consumed everything. The museum exists because some things are too sacred to be owned by corporations. Some voices are too important to be reduced to line items on a balance sheet. Otis Redding did not lose his battle with the music industry. He did not even know he was fighting one. He was too busy singing, too busy pouring every ounce of himself into every performance, every recording, every note. He sang like a man who knew his time was short, even though he could not have known how short it actually was. He sang like every song might be his last. And, in the end, one of them was. Perhaps that is the most painful part of this story. Not the contracts, not the stolen masters. The most painful part is the silence. The songs never written. The albums never recorded. The evolution never allowed to happen. And maybe that is why the whistle at the end of Dock of the Bay still haunts us. It is the sound of a man who had finally found peace. A man who had stopped chasing the approval of an industry that would never treat him fairly, and started simply being. Sitting, watching, whistling. Some voices do not fade. They do not grow old. They simply wait for the next generation to discover them. Otis Redding's voice has been waiting for over 50 years, and it will keep waiting, because some messages are too important to die with the messenger. If this story moved you, if the voice of Otis Redding has ever made you feel something you could not explain, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you do not miss the next story about the legends who changed music forever. And leave a comment telling us which Otis Redding song means the most to you. We read every single one.